Hello, welcome back to the podcast. For those of you who are new, I'm Rennie. I go by Healing with Rennie. I just changed my handle, so bear with me as I get used to it. On Instagram, on Threads, on TikTok now. And if you're seeing me for the first time, welcome to the podcast slash YouTube channel where I talk about my lived experience with borderline personality disorder, aka BPD, mental health, self-growth, spirituality, all of the above. Yeah, and I'm glad you're here. I know that there's a lot going on right now, so I'm just gonna dive right into it. Today I really want to talk about light culture. And this is something that I've been reflecting on as someone who's in my self-proclaimed villain era. I have mixed feelings about that term, villain era. But really, what it is in a certain part of your healing, you have to learn how to set boundaries with yourself, with others. And it really requires to unlearn a lot of people-pleasing tendencies, which when I was younger, I really struggled with. But I am complete opposite of that now. But I think that for me, as someone who's extremely direct and blunt, I also struggle with balance sometimes. And so I know that because of my episodes, but also not even just my BPD episodes, but also just the way that I communicate, the way that I articulate myself, I've often been misunderstood. I also want to add that I'm a Black woman, so I can't deny that that has impacted a lot of my experiences as well. I think that I've been very misunderstood throughout my life because of my thoughts and opinions. And, if you couple in the fact that I'm also neurodivergent, there have been a lot of instances in my life where I've been misunderstood, where my words have felt twisted from my perspective, or where I've just been perceived aggressively. And there are times where I have been extremely aggressive, and there are other times where I've simply been just trying to express myself, and that expression was usually not met with the best responses. And so, something that has been really difficult for me to learn is to differentiate between when I'm responding and reacting out of my own projections and trauma and fears, and when other people are doing so. And I've kind of touched on this in some of the previous episodes, but I feel like since then, I feel like I have a way deeper understanding of this and more discernment to recognize when it's something I know I'm doing and I need to hold myself accountable for versus when someone else is projecting onto me and I'm being misunderstood or misrepresented. And so that's kind of what I mean when I mean the villain era. Because I think a lot of times we use that term and we're not necessarily villains. It's more so that we're being perceived negatively. And sometimes that perception can be rooted in, like, yes, we need to change our behaviors. And other times it could just be other people projecting their own fears or insecurities onto us. And so learning to recognize the difference is hard. But I want to, before we kind of dive into it, just share like some updates that has led me to these reflections. I've been in such a transformative season of life this year. I think a lot of people have. I think 2025 is just one of those years. And if you're like me and you're a nerd about like astrology and energies, energetics, spirituality, then you know that this is a big year for that. We are experiencing astrological transits that we have not experienced in our entire lifetime. And for some of us, not some of us, but for most of us, like these transits are like they haven't happened in hundreds of years or a lot of years. So this is like a first in a generation type of energy that a lot of us are navigating through. And with that, a lot is being revealed, not just collectively. Obviously, we're seeing that, but also internally within our own personal lives and within ourselves. I know for me personally, a lot has surfaced for me in terms of old wounding, childhood traumas, but also like where I've held myself back. So where I need to set boundaries with others and how I'm showing up and how others, have impacted me and contributed to a lot of the issues that I have with my own mental health and so forth, but also how that has impacted how I show up in the world, how I treat myself, how I treat others. For me, like I've had issues with relationships, interpersonal relationships, friendships, romantic relationships for a long time, for the majority of my adult life. I've struggled with disassociation. I've struggled with psychosis. I've struggled with like suicidal ideation, I've been inpatient, I've been in treatment, I've done the Western modalities, and I've more recently explored more holistic and ancestral and decolonized practices that I personally resonate more with and find more helpful. And so I just feel like there's a lot that I've learned throughout this time, and it's been really challenging this year to navigate some of those wounds surfacing for me, but also navigate like how I have held myself back and some of the core beliefs and limitations that I had still held on to that was impacting how I show up in relationships, particularly like relationships with men, which is something that I've talked about that I really struggle with. But also in friendships too, and just in community in general. I think I lack a lot of trust in people because of a lot of my experiences, but also I have some tendencies that are either that have historically been codependent or very avoidant. And so for me, a lot of this year has not only been making like external changes that I think from the outside looking in can just come across as instability, which it feels like that for sure. But also I recognize that I'm someone who sees the bigger picture, and these changes that I'm making now, I know are necessary because it's part of me learning not only how to choose myself and love myself, which is something I've struggled with as someone who lives with BPD and complex trauma, but it's also me learning how to figure out who I am apart from the pain and the fear and actually unlearn those limiting beliefs that contribute to those unhealthy coping mechanisms and patterns of behavior. And as I've been doing that shadow work, as I call it, or inner work, whatever you want to call it, whatever you resonate with, it has made it so apparent to me who is also doing that and who is not doing that. And that's been really difficult because then I feel like I have to make changes in my own life of, what feels in alignment and what doesn't. And this goes for jobs, this goes for friendships, relationships. I have definitely been in a season of just leaving and cutting people off. And, I've ended relationships left and right. And I feel like I'm very unapologetic about it because I've lived so long, functioning from a place of self-loathing and accepting things that I don't deserve, and also having people unknowingly oftentimes project their own pain onto me. And now I can recognize it because I know that I've done that for so much of my life that I can see when other people are doing that. And I'm also someone with an incredibly direct communication style. Hello, Sagittarius. But a lot of people are very uncomfortable with that. When you meet them with honesty, when you hold them accountable, a lot of the modern day culture is very groupthink, and it scares me because people don't like dissent. They don't want to be in community or in relationships that challenge them or makes them confront something within themselves that requires growth and healing. And that lack of accountability and that lack of tolerance for dissent and challenge, uh, it doesn't sit right with me. And it brings me to the point of polite culture because I feel like that kind of connects to it. So not only are we living in a time where I feel like it's very divided and groupthink is very strong, and I'm someone who really values being a free thinker and not just conforming to whatever groups are around me, whatever that looks like. Even if there's a group I predominantly agree with, I'm always going to want to challenge the people to think for themselves and to confront where within themselves they still need to grow as I'm learning to do so within myself. And I think I've been trying to learn the balance of not forcing growth on other people just because I am, and instead of forcing growth, removing myself from environments and spaces that don't feel aligned, and instead align, like finding what does feel aligned rather than pushing people into growth or change that they're not ready for or not willing to do or are uncomfortable with, right? Uh, that was a mouthful, but that's kind of where I've been at, and it's been really hard for me to navigate that, and I'm really still learning that. And sometimes it leads to me just ended up crashing out and losing patience and tolerance for people. Other times it leads to me just completely cutting people off, and other times it leads to really healing and profoundly meaningful conversations where we can both understand each other and we can both like help each other grow and hold each other accountable. And that is something that I feel like I value right now, that I feel like a lot of us are struggling with. And it's unfortunate because it's something that we're going to have to learn as we're learning to build community is conflict resolution and learning to tolerate dissent and, people challenging us and holding us accountable and holding ourselves accountable and like recognizing where we need to change. And so with that, I want to talk about polite culture. So when I think of polite culture, I think of us kind of, I don't want to say it's exactly like people pleasing, but I feel like there are some similarities where there's this discomfort with being honest or speaking in a way that someone might disagree with, right? It feels like you want to be perceived as kind, and so oftentimes that's conflated with just being agreeable. And I feel like for me, like I have a very different understanding of what being a good person, what being a kind person is. I would not consider myself a nice person. I would consider myself a kind person. I think I have a good heart. I think I care about people. I am not a nice person because I don't value politeness at all. I don't think that politeness is something everyone is afforded just because they're on this earth. I don't. Kindness, yes. Politeness, no. Those are different things to me. And I feel like a lot of people don't really agree with that. That might be a hot take, right? You might conflate those two things. I do not. I feel that there are times when you need to be brutally honest with people, and that is not always perceived as polite, right? Like sometimes that requires you to be assertive and honest in a way that could potentially hurt someone's feelings or make them uncomfortable. It's not necessarily going to be perceived as polite, but is it the right thing to do or the kind thing to do? I think so. I think that if you care about someone, then the right thing to do and the kind thing to do is to be honest with them, especially if they have patterns or behaviors that are causing harm to themselves or others, or are limiting them in some way or contributing negatively to, their life or their relationships. I think that we do our friends and the people we care about a disservice when we are just being polite, meaning we say all the right things. We want to be agreeable. We don't want to, stir the pot. We don't want to cause conflict. But sometimes conflict is required as part of growth and relationship building. And I feel like where we're at right now as a collective is a pivotal moment where we really need to learn how to work together. And I'm realizing that a lot of Americans struggle with this, for one, because of, colonization really implanted that hyper individualism that I feel like a lot of us, particularly those of us from like marginalized and indigenous backgrounds, our ancestors lived in community. We had village mindset, and it's very different. And I feel like a lot of us are feeling called intuitively to go back to that because we need community so much right now. But we have been conditioned to only think about ourselves. And it can be really hard to understand that we actually need conflict resolution skills, and conflict is healthy, and that conflict can be managed in a healthy way. Now, I do want to pause and say, I am not someone historically that has done a good job of having conflict. I have not necessarily had healthy conflict skills. I am someone who was diagnosed with more of the petulant type of BPD previously. I was very aggressive and very, um, just there was a lot of rage that I had within me, and oftentimes I would lash out and I would cause a lot of harm. My mouth is crazy. So there's a lot of things that I've said and done that has caused harm, and I do acknowledge that. I try to always hold myself accountable, and I know that I can't tell other people how to feel or disregard the impact of my words and actions. And so I try to always say, like, okay, I know that wasn't right. I'm going to be honest, there are times when I genuinely do not care. And there are times when, if this relationship matters to me, then I try to hold myself accountable and be honest and do the work required to change it, which takes time. It's not an overnight process usually. But I say all that to say, I'm learning healthy conflict resolution skills, and as I'm learning that, I'm realizing how many people, whether they're diagnosed with any type of condition or not, do not have that and aren't really interested in acquiring it. Instead, they would rather kind of lean into this polite culture that I speak of where it's being agreeable, only keeping people in their circle that they agree with. Um, Someone's screaming outside. Sorry if you heard that. But basically only keeping people in their close vicinity and their close relationships that they agree with. And if there is any sign of conflict, it's like immediately they're gone, right? That's something that I've noticed has become super commonplace. I was actually blaming it on the city that I live in, but I realized that I think that our culture has kind of shifted towards that, especially like after COVID and like with social media. I feel like it's very easy for people to just disappear and ghost and flake and not really work on things. And, we are very, it's interesting to be someone diagnosed with BPD, which is, a lot of the condition focuses around unlearning splitting, which is like intense black and white thinking, right? And it's so interesting to live in a society that is so incredibly black and white, where it's kind of all or nothing. It's like you either agree with everything that I say, or we can't be friends and I'll never speak to you again. And it's frustrating because I feel like healthy relationships actually require dissent and require conflict and us learning how to resolve that conflict. Of course, like we have to determine for ourselves if it's worth it to us. Like if this relationship feels valuable enough to us for us to fight for it and for us to have, the stress, because it is not easy, right? So we have to determine if we're willing to deal with the stress of like navigating conflict resolution. And again, you also have to learn those skills if those aren't skills you have, which I would argue a lot of us don't really have the healthiest conflict resolution skills. I think that a lot of us can either be really avoidant, which I've been guilty of, or really aggressive, which I've also been guilty of, or we can just kind of be people pleasers. And again, that polite culture of just being as agreeable as possible, which I see a lot as well. So, it's a struggle. It's something that I feel like we have to work on. And I feel like with the transits that we're navigating through right now and into next year, we won't have a choice because, I feel like the masks are coming off and we're seeing everything very clearly. And because we're seeing everything very clearly, this is an opportunity for us to actually work on that. Not only collectively, but internally. Like there are things coming up within each of us individually that we also need to address. It can't just be that person needs to change, the system needs to change. It also has to be we have to change too. And so that process is not fun. Again, I've talked a little bit about shadow work before. I think that it gets thrown around a lot on the internet, but people don't understand really what that entails. It is not a fun or comfortable process. It's extremely difficult, it's extremely painful, it's uncomfortable. And I feel like we live in a culture where people want to be comfortable. And right now, with everything that's happening, we are literally being forced and pushed outside of our comfort zone because that is where the change happens and that is where the growth happens. And so I would really argue that right now we need to step away from this polite culture. We need to step out of like wanting to be seen as the bigger person or the agreeable person or the kindest person or the nicest person. No. And I'm not saying to go out and just burn everything down and, lash out like I have done historically. I can tell you right now it's not the best idea, right? I've done it. I know what it's like. It can cause a lot of issues. But what I am saying is that we really need to get out of this mentality that we need to be so agreeable to a fault, to the point to where we will not hold people accountable and we will not hold ourselves accountable and we will not tolerate other people holding us accountable. Like accountability needs to be the word for the next decade, I think. And again, this is something that's learned. Like I'm not coming on here speaking like someone who has it all figured out because I don't. I'm sharing from the perspective of someone who's actively learning these things, as someone who is healing from and unlearning so much connected to intense childhood trauma and complex trauma. And I am someone who's learning emotional regulation as a full-grown adult, right? These are skills that many of us should have learned in childhood. Unfortunately, a lot of us learned instead we develop maladaptive coping skills. And maybe it's not as intense as someone like myself who's diagnosed with a cluster B disorder, like borderline personality disorder, or if you're someone who resonates more with bipolar or have other diagnoses. Maybe it's not even that extreme per se, but a lot of us still don't have the healthiest coping mechanisms and conflict resolution skills. And so a lot of us as adults are learning that because I think, especially for like my generation, I'm a millennial, our parents didn't teach us that. And a lot of like Gen X and Boomer parents, they lack emotional maturity. This is not the case across the board, but I think that this has been like a shared experience that I find a lot of people in my generation speak about is that, a lot of our ancestors, a lot of our parents, a lot of the generations prior to us, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds and communities, they were just trying to survive, right? So they didn't really learn emotional regulation skills and they didn't really teach us that. A lot of them thought, like, as long as you're fed and you have a roof over your head, you're fine, right? And so now a lot of us are, we're navigating anxiety, depression, like all of these different mental health things, coupled with just all that we've gone through collectively for the past 5 or so years and more if you're from these backgrounds and your communities have always struggled, right? So it's not easy. I don't want it to sound like this is like an overnight easy thing to do. I just want to acknowledge that we have been conditioned a lot by society and these, cultural norms that I feel like at this stage of where we're at collectively, it's just not going to fly anymore. I think it's time for us to unlearn it. I think that if we don't make an intentional choice to get uncomfortable and like really confront what's happening within each of us individually and not just looking to like those around us to change, right? Because I feel like over the past couple of years, I've heard a lot of people say things like I'm triggered. And for a number of years, I would just try my best to avoid being triggered, right? If someone was triggering me, I would leave. And I think now more people have an understanding to some degree of the term triggered, right? Which I hate that we're just throwing around these terms that, like, we did not go to school for psychology. So it kind of annoys me, but I have mixed feelings about it, right? But I notice that when someone says, I'm triggering you or you're triggering me, the first instinct is to end a relationship to go away. That is not healthy in my opinion. Now, if it's like so continuous and like nothing's actively being done to address it, then that can be a problem, obviously, right? You don't want to stay in dynamics that are harmful to you. And I know that I am not a fun person to be around when I'm continuously triggered and I'm not like actively working on it. And this is something I struggle with when it comes to relationships with men in particular. I am really struggling to have close relationships, romantic relationships with men. There's just so much trauma and fear there that comes up for me. Um, but I digress. I feel like it is a detriment to us and to our own growth for us to just avoid our triggers. Your triggers are there for a reason. It's trying to communicate something within you that needs attention, that needs healing.